All right. Good afternoon again. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. My name is Ross Siegel. I'm the director of the Master of Arts program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. And it's a pleasure to be one of the co-organizers of the event for the co-edited volume on Advancing Holocaust Studies, together with Dr. Alon Confino from UMass Amherst, from the Institute of Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies in UMass Amherst, and also the Sara and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center, also at Stockton University. I'd like to begin by introducing panels and the panelists, and we'll go from there. I'll introduce them according to the order of how they will talk. So Dr. Carol Rittner is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Dr. Marcia Radikoff-Grossman Professor Emerita of Holocaust Studies at Stockton University. Dr. John K. Roth is the Edward J. Sexton Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights, now the Magrubian Center for Human Rights. Dr. Debórah Dwork is the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center in CUNY. Dr. James E. Young is Distinguished University Professor of English and Judaic Studies Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he has taught since 1988, and the founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. And Dr. Lisa Leff is the director of the Jack, Joseph, and Martin Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the USHMM, and professor of history at American University. It's also a pleasure to introduce my colleague and good friend, Dr. Alon Confino, professor of history and of Jewish studies, Ben Tishkach Chair of Holocaust Studies, and director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. Alon, please.
Thank you, Raz. Welcome, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure to welcome, first of all, the illustrious group of scholars that we have here with us today to discuss the future of Holocaust studies, and welcome to all of our guests. Advancing Holocaust Studies is an important book, and we would like to have a good conversation about it. I'm going to pose 3 questions and let each of our participants answer them and give us his or her take. Then we are going to open up the conversation among the participants for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Please write your questions in the Q&A. You will see the Q&A tab at the bottom. This is the best way, and Raz and I will moderate the discussion. So the 3 questions we would like our participants to think through are the following. The Holocaust, as we know, has become dominant as a memory and a field of study in the last 2-3 decades. It is the only case of genocide with an internationally recognized day of remembrance. And Holocaust studies also constitute an exceptional field of study, exceptionally recognized, including academic programs and journals without parallel to other cases of genocide, say Native American genocide studies or Armenian genocide studies. There are dozens of Holocaust centers in the United States and around the world, and dozens of museums and monuments, and with good reason, of course. The first question is this exceptional character of Holocaust studies still warranted today in your view? The second question is about the great advances in research on the Holocaust in the last 20 years, which have placed it within a broad context of Jewish, German, European, and global genocide studies. Does the exceptional character of the Holocaust studies then contribute or pose an obstacle to the agenda of the edited volume Advancing Holocaust Studies of studying and teaching the Holocaust in a world, I quote from the volume, wrecked by anti-Semitism, immigration and refugee crisis, human rights abuses, mass atrocity crimes, threats of nuclear war, the COVID-19 pandemic, and environmental degradation. So what are the relations between the comparative global aspect of the Holocaust and its presumed exceptional character? And finally, we'd like our participants to think about the following question. How do you see the field in the next several years? Which questions, issues, and cases do you see as central and urgent to explore? So we are going to hear now from our participants, first Carol, then John, Debórah, James, and Lisa. And then we are open up the conversation among us, and then open up the floor for questions. Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, the Holocaust is dominant as a memory and a field of study when it comes to genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries. In fact, it is dominant when it comes to genocides generally. And I am convinced that for the foreseeable future, the Holocaust should remain dominant. Why? Not because of the number of victims, nor because of the proportion of that number compared to the whole group the Nazis defined as Jews, and not because of the brutality and sadism of the Holocaust. It should remain dominant, at least for the foreseeable future, because the Holocaust was a global event. The Nazis aimed to annihilate everyone all over the world they defined as a Jew. Men, women, and children, young and old, rich and poor, religious, non-religious, and atheist. The annihilation of the Jews was the central issue for the Nazis, because the Nazis represented all they opposed: liberalism, democracy, humanitarianism, collective morality, and so on. The Holocaust was a genocide motivated by an unpragmatic, irrational, and fanatic ideology. Of course, ideology can be found as a motivator in other genocides, Armenia, Cambodia, and Rwanda, for example. But the genocidal project to annihilate the Jews was reinforced within a civilization and by a dominant Christian society, populated, influenced, developed, and driven theologically, politically, socially, culturally, and intellectually by Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christianity, by Christians who had been informed, deformed, and nurtured by centuries and centuries of Christian teaching and preaching of contempt for Jews and Judaism. This is not insignificant historically, nor is it insignificant to me personally as a believing, practicing Roman Catholic Christian teacher and scholar of the Holocaust. Questions about the dominance of Holocaust research, remembrance, and education stem from what I would call unnecessary issues of competitive memory among some genocide scholars. Of course, we must study about other genocides and genocidal events, whether it is that of Native Americans in this country, the Rohingya in Myanmar, or the Uyghurs in China. But does memory have to be unidirectional? Why can't memory be multi-directional, multi-traumatic, multi-eventful? Why do genocide memories have to compete or seem to compete with each other? And why should we scholars and teachers encourage it? Holocaust studies has been a useful lens through which to study other genocides and insights from other genocides have informed and deepened our understanding of the Holocaust. Why can't we learn about and from different, difficult, painful pasts in such a way as to gain deeper insights into historical events and human beings, perpetrators, victims, rescuers, and bystanders? And why can't we do so in a way that enables us to develop solidarity against social injustice, persecution, and violence today? The Holocaust is not the only genocide internationally recognized. Yom HaShoah and International Holocaust Remembrance Day are days on which we remember the 6 million Jews and their helpers. But the international community also commemorates other days as well. For example, April 7th is the day we remember the victims of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. April 24th is the day we remember the Armenian genocide. And August 2nd is the day we remember the Roma victims murdered in the genocide carried out by Nazi Germany and its fascist nationalist partners and collaborators who participated in those crimes. The United Nations Genocide Outreach Program supports all these days with exhibitions, educational resources, and programs. As for questions, issues, and cases I consider important to explore now and in the future, the opening of the Vatican archives gives us the opportunity to focus anew on issues and questions about the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Pius XII, and the Holocaust. And we must do so. Who knew what? When did they know it? And what did they do about what they knew? Other questions also are very much on my mind after the events of January 6, 2021, and the second impeachment trial and acquittal of former President Trump by 47 members of the Republican Party. How does hate speech contribute to a people's genocidal mentality? And how do politicians serve as enablers who prepare the way for genocide?
Thank you so much, Carol. John.
Thank you. I'm going to take a personal approach to what I take the first question to be about, which is the exceptional character of the Holocaust studies still warranted today? I joined Carol Rittner on the Advancing Holocaust Studies book project because I wanted to take stock of the centrality I have given to the Holocaust in my own life during 50 years of learning, teaching, and writing about that catastrophe. My academic career was well underway when the Holocaust, as I like to say it, found me more than I found it. Primarily through reading, I first encountered persons and places, decisions and disasters, actions and atrocities that challenged my identity as a Christian philosopher. It became immensely important to me to find out more about that event. One thing led to another, and I became a Holocaust scholar and educator. Over time, two developments emerged. First, by focusing on the Holocaust, I learned that I could not concentrate on the Holocaust alone. If my inquiry remained anchored in study of the Holocaust, that made me confront other genocides, torture, sexualized violence, and more. Second, my work in advancing Holocaust studies, education, and memorialization was motivated by the hope that such efforts could reduce anti-Semitism, decrease crimes against humanity, limit genocide, and champion human rights. Unfortunately, as I did my work, the world seemed to get worse, not better. Not because of my work, but in spite of it. My work in Holocaust studies and education remains important. I have seen good it can do, but I have greater appreciation now for the respectful modesty that the tasks of advancing Holocaust studies require. Turning explicitly to the book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, I want to emphasize that the book is subversive. It calls its title concept into question. At least it does so by suggesting that teaching, researching, and writing about the Holocaust are affected not only by that event's receding into the past, but also by current chaos, destruction, and failure that preclude business as usual. So the book's arguments include the insight that unless purported advances in the field grapple deeply with the question, what's it for? Those advances will scarcely be advances at all. Sure, the massive institutionalization of Holocaust studies can keep generating conferences, centers, and careers. It can keep producing books, films, and memorials, but to what end? What if all of that activity stopped? What difference would that make? How much worse off would humankind be if those causes and institutions and the support behind them failed to exist and flourish? I hasten to add that I don't want to find out the answer to those questions. But I think that Holocaust studies neither can nor should take its future for granted. I think that we study and teach about the Holocaust because it happened, but ethical reasons govern that work. If they don't, what's the point of Holocaust studies, education, and memorialization? But if ethical reasons do govern that work, then I think that we have to embrace the likelihood that our position as Holocaust scholars and educators is akin to that of Sisyphus. Our rock gets pushed up the hill only to roll down to the bottom again and again. Will I keep doing that arguably forlorn work? My answer is, that's what I do. Now, what about where the field of Holocaust studies should go in the future, and what questions and issues and cases do I see as central and urgent to explore? These questions make me ask another question, namely, what can Holocaust studies do? At least three things come to mind. First, Holocaust studies can identify what is known about the Holocaust, how it happened, and why. Second, it can point toward what is unknown and arguably unknowable about the Holocaust. And third, it can raise and explore in distinctive ways fundamental questions such as, who are we? What is right and what is not? What is good and what is most important? Are we doing the best we can? My sense is that as Holocaust studies advances such inquiries, it should and will become more diverse and diffuse. It should and will accent the event's reverberations and implications as much as the particularity of historical episodes. Such developments will pay rightful tribute to the Holocaust's vastness. Again, I stress that the work of Holocaust studies requires respectful modesty. That work should consider how current events, including genocidal ones, do and should affect study and education about the Holocaust, and how Holocaust studies and education may provide insight that helps us to cope with the dilemmas that besiege us.
Thank you, John. Debórah.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this wonderful panel. And thanks to John and to Carol for doing the book. Thank you so very much. I start by clarifying my answer to John and Carol's question, what is Holocaust studies for? In my view, Holocaust studies serves as a source of insight for each of us as we make personal and political choices. Study of the Holocaust affords us opportunities to consider everyday matters through a rich historical lens. And it offers us a vocabulary to talk about grave problems we face in the public domain. Holocaust studies offers us an analytic framework to interpret unfolding events, and study of the Holocaust reveals what I call the underlying grammar of current socio-political situations. The exceptional character of Holocaust studies both contributes to and poses an obstacle to those aims. Contributes to precisely because the ubiquitous nature of Holocaust centers, museums, monuments, and memorials, let alone films, novels, scholarship, and classroom education, all of that ensures a common vocabulary, a shared analytic framework. Thus, for example, when the former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger posted a video to Twitter after the assault on the Capitol, he used Kristallnacht as his starting point, trusting that it would resonate with his listeners. I am very aware of Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, he began. It was a night of rampage against the Jews carried out in 1938 by the Nazi equivalent of the Proud Boys. Wednesday was the day of broken glass right here in the United States. And he went on, it all started with lies and lies and lies and intolerance. Listeners understood perfectly. Within hours, his video had been viewed 12 million times. Indeed, that vocabulary is shared by the seditionists too. Think of the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt or the 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, t-shirt. The strength of that shared vocabulary is also the obstacle. The Holocaust looms so large that it impedes or can impede critical analysis and unfettered perspective. Not everything is about the Holocaust. Some events, phenomena, and problems need another lens, and the Holocaust frame blinkers our view. I am not persuaded, for example, that the Holocaust offers the best analytic frame to understand the present political, social, and human rights violence in Myanmar. Rather, I would suggest minority rights scholarship. Similarly, I would suggest we break out of the Holocaust studies frame to analyze and understand the violence on our southern border. You will thus not be surprised that my answer to the question, is the exceptional character of Holocaust studies still warranted today, is no, it is not. Worse, what was once helpful, drawing upon, relying on Holocaust studies to create a bridge to genocide studies and other investigations into mass violence, now curbs and delimits. Not always, of course, but too often. Finally, what do I think most urgent to explore? Where would I like the field to go? With 80 million refugees and displaced people around the world today, more than twice as many as at war's end, 80 million who have survived and fled state violence, I find refugees, the structures that forcibly displaced them, and the international, national, and local responses to them, I find this the most pressing issue to pursue. Untethered from the Holocaust studies frame, we may well find that investigation of these problems takes us to domains like environmental studies that have little to do with the Nazi past.
Thank you, Debórah. James.
So I want to thank everybody for showing up. And see, I have alone in my picture almost solely, so I get to have this conversation almost to respond to your questions a little. So Alon's questions on the exceptionalism of the Holocaust and kind of its presumed kind of centrality reminds me a little bit of kind of a long-going discussion I had with Reinhard Koselleck in the 80s. I was at Bielefeld for a while as a fellow there. Koselleck is a wonderful historian and scholar of kind of a transitions between history and memory and back again. And at that point, I was also invited to join this jury, this Findungskommission, to find a memorial design for the Denkmal in Berlin. And Reinhard wrote a wonderful essay against the memorial, against building a single memorial to Europe's murdered Jews in Berlin, fearing that it would create a hierarchy of memory in Berlin, that the Jews would be at the top of the pile, and all the other groups would somehow be buried beneath memory of the Jews and the destruction of the Jews during World War II. And I was expected to answer this as part of this Findungskommission, and I said, look, I think that it's legitimate to fear that, the Holocaust or the mass murder of the Jews would come to take the place of everything else that happened during the war. But I didn't see it then, and this was 1998, 97, 98, 99. But I never saw it as a zero-sum compilation. Already I was thinking of it in terms that Michael Rothberg has suggested, this multi-directional memory, in which it's not a zero sum of one memory instead of another. But I said that you begin somewhere, and by creating a central memorial in Berlin to the murder of Europe's Jews, you create maybe the first node in what will become a memorial matrix of other memorials. Other groups murdered during the Holocaust will now be remembered in relationship to the mass murder of the Jews. And in fact, it might be impossible to disentangle the mass murder of the Jews from the killing methods of the T-Fear program or the euthanasia program, several years before. As we know, the mass murder of disabled in Germany preceded the mass murder of Jews. And many of the techniques used to kill the disabled were used in the extermination camps in Poland to murder the Jews. And this was the discussion I had with Reinhard, and he had to agree. But he said, well, let's wait and see if this is what happens. And in fact, this is what happened. Memorials to the murder victims of the T4 program, the Tiergarten 4 mass murder of disabled euthanasia program was built after the Denkmal, as was the memorial to the mass murder of Sinti and Roma, built right across the street in the Tiergarten, from the Denkmal. Many other memorials as well to other groups of victims are being built nearby. So sure enough, there is the homosexual memorial is right across the street, and actually uses one of the Stele as a form, inside which there is a video showing two men kissing in love. So it's, again, I would point away from the exceptionalism to the multi-directional memory of the Holocaust. and kind of reiterate Carol's point that in fact we do have other international memorial days for other genocides. You know, the April 24th day for the Armenian genocide, the August 2nd day for Sinti and Roma, among others, and kind of keep this in mind. Now, this comes up in every discussion I have when I'm invited to consult governments on how to commemorate other mass murders, unfortunately. Becoming a kind of an expert in Holocaust studies, unfortunately, makes us an expert in how to think about mass murder and how to remember mass murders in other contexts as well, which is to suggest that it's actually a two-way street. That when asked, what should we do? And so there's nothing, we have to ask first, toward what end are we remembering? Are we remembering in order to stop new and present unfolding genocides? And that question was answered decisively, in fact, by Joschka Fischer during the attempted genocide of Kosovar Albanians by the Serbs in 1995, when right in the middle of, or 1999, when right in the middle of the Holocaust Denkmal discussions, Joschka Fischer joined in a coalition to make it a red-green coalition in Germany, and joined this coalition with Gerhard Schroeder on the condition that the Denkmal go ahead and be built. And then he pushed for Germany to join the NATO air forces in bombing Serbia to stop the certain genocide of Kosovar Albanians. And this is right during the Denkmal debate. And he said, we're debating the Denkmal, but in fact, we need to be debating what this Denkmal must inspire us to do. And for the very first time, they allowed German forces to leave German soil to intervene in a new and unfolding genocide in Kosovo. So this just comes back, I think, to the ways that what we learned, especially during the Kosovo time, and also during Bosnia and Herzegovina and the mass murder of Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina by the Serbs, you know, in the early 90s, that in fact we may end up being less able to talk about how to understand current crises. I think some of the current persecutions and current genocides actually allow us to go back and understand the Holocaust in new and insightful ways. It turns us into scholars of contemporary, you know, persecutions like this as a way to illuminate things that we didn't understand before about the Holocaust. And I think we have to keep that kind of that mutual two-way street you know, lane open for the studies when we go to teach the Holocaust. It's a plural study, as John and Carol made clear in their introduction. Holocaust studies are plural studies. Thanks so much.
Thank you, James. Lisa, please.
Thank you, Alon. And it's such an honor to be with all of you on this panel and to see all the participants who, many of whom are experts in their own right and will have much to add with their questions. So Alon, you asked us to comment on the exceptional character of the Holocaust in contemporary memorial cultures. In my contribution to the volume, I talk about how Holocaust studies emerged during the Holocaust itself in places like the Warsaw Ghetto, and it self-consciously understood itself, or its makers understood themselves to be doing something really radical. You know, the journalist Gustava Jurecka, who's one of the contributors to the Oyneg Shabbos project, she said that what they were doing was throwing a stone under the wheel of history. And I always think about that. You know, what does it mean to be telling history from the point of view of someone other than the victor? It's really, you know, history is, you know, John Roth earlier talked about business as usual. The business as usual of history has always been the story of the victor, and Holocaust studies emerges as a surprise, as something that should not have happened. And it's amazing that it did. And some of us on this panel have written about why, you know, that there's a certain generational dynamic that made it possible when it emerged, but it is still very striking and surprising. And, you know, maybe it shouldn't therefore surprise us that it did not change everything. History of most things still goes on as business as usual. That is to say, violence, oppression, those histories are still erased or often forgotten, right? And still much of what we write justifies or excuses or erases that, right? So just to bring up one example that's very much on my mind, in my field of French history, there is an astounding contradiction over the past few decades. On the one hand, we've got an explosion of French memorial culture about the Holocaust, even, you know, to the point of some scholars saying there's a surfeit of memory. You know, I'll leave aside whether or not that's the case. Certainly there's massive state investment in Holocaust memorialization and so much scholarship on the topic. And yet, at the same time, there's been a crackdown on those who would like to write in equal terms about the history of the damage wrought by French colonialism in places like Africa and Asia. You know, keep in mind that 15 years ago, France required textbooks that taught about French colonialism. They required that these books emphasize the benefits of colonialism for the colonized, right? So this is the same culture, memorializing the Holocaust and emphasizing the benefits of colonialism for the colonized. And these issues still go on today, right? Recently, French President Emmanuel Macron, you know, announced that he wants to purge from the universities the influence of Americans who would want to get French scholars to look at oppression of people in France according to race. All this to say, what Jurecka and other members of the Oyneg Shabbos group called the wheel of history, that is history written by the victors, it still turns. It is as powerful as ever. So even though we as Holocaust historians, we always say never again, in fact, we haven't done much, or we have not been as successful as we would have wanted to be in really stepping back and having a new theory of history that would do something different. But the other part of your question, Alon, is there room for hope, or where are the directions where Holocaust historians could inspire something other than business as usual? And one of the areas that I think is particularly interesting for Holocaust scholars, because most of us are not going to jump out of our field and bring other histories to light, but rather to see larger connections, to make a different frame for our scholarship that allows us to see the history of the Holocaust in relation to other histories of oppression. So to take two really famous and well-known examples of scholarship that does that, one book that comes to mind is Tim Snyder's Bloodlands, right? Which very appropriately puts in a common frame the history of the Holocaust with a history that came before in the same region. And here we can see, without taking away from the specificity of the Holocaust, how it connects to another history, right? To a Soviet history of oppression that had happened just a decade before. Another really famous example of a book that widens the lens is a book I absolutely love, a classic, Isabelle Hull's Absolute Destruction, right? Which looks at German military culture, which became such an important force in the Holocaust, but developed earlier from, you know, World War I and even before the genocide of the Herero and Nama at the beginning of the 20th century in Southwest Africa. A connected history like that requires taking a different geographical lens. It requires a different historical approach, but it can be so promising in linking the history of the Holocaust to other atrocities. And I would end just by saying, you know, it's not just the geographical expansion that's helpful for us, it's also pushing into new methodologies. So all of this work that's been done on gender and sexuality and the Holocaust, I think allows us to see different history without collapsing them into one history, allows us to see them in a common frame. And so too do critical histories of anti-Semitism and racism allow us to understand a common framework for these histories. And I'll end there because I know people have a lot of questions they want to jump in on.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, all of you, for being so illuminating in such a short time. It was really magnificent. I'd like to open up our conversation by raising two thoughts. So if I understood correctly, John and Lisa raised the question, John raised it, what if Holocaust studies stopped? Because what have we achieved if we study all this and the world continues to be violent and unjust? If I understood correctly, Lisa and John in different ways raised this issue. And my question to us is, aren't we asking too much of Holocaust studies? Because we can ask this question also about history. We study the past. And we know that we study the past not in order not to repeat it in the future. It's not true. We study the past and we repeat often the mistakes of the future, but we study the past in order to be wiser, in order to have a sense of perspective, in order to be self-conscious, in order to have historical consciousness. So I wonder whether it is fair for Holocaust studies that we will think that its reason to exist is only if things will improve in the world. Maybe we should study it for many different reasons. And one other point that I want to raise is I noticed a tension and perhaps even a contradiction between John and Carol on the one hand and Debórah on the other hand. Debórah said that she thinks that the exceptional character of the Holocaust is not warranted these days. She mentioned the issue of the immigrants, of the refugees. And I think John and Carol had a little bit of a different idea. So maybe we can discuss this. But I open the conversation for whatever comments you want to have on each other's wonderful contributions. Please. Yes, Debórah.
So in response to you, Alon, I have frequently wondered why we shoulder Holocaust studies with improving the world. In the United States in particular, it seems kind of crazy. Why isn't it the history of the civil rights movement, for example? That would seem to me to make a whole lot more sense. And as to the differences between Carol and John's position and my position, Carol, you are so persuasive that I was nearly persuaded to jump onto your turf, but it goes only right. So thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful presentation, which I found very powerful and moving. And yet I still feel that by now, the exceptional nature of Holocaust studies has become more of an obstacle than a help in terms of shared vocabulary and analytic framework.
I can't really respond at this point about the hindrance, but I would just make this one point about are we asking too much of Holocaust studies, and what has it all been for? I think we have not found a way, if I could put it this way, we haven't found a way to measure the effects of Holocaust studies. I mean, I in the book, I forget if it was in my essay or in, I have the book here, or one of the introductions that John and I wrote, we mentioned Hank Greenspan, whom many of you know from the University of Michigan, who wrote an essay and commented on the helicopter pilot at the time of My Lai, who, when he saw what was happening to civilians who were being machine gunned by American soldiers, he had an image in his head of victims of the Nazis, Jews who were victims of the Nazis and non-Jews as well, being machine gunned into pits. And it was that reference for him that caused him put his helicopter down and to threaten to shoot American soldiers. But we don't have many stories like that. I mean, I think we don't really know what the effect of our teaching has been. I mean, we see all the terrible things happening. We see things that you reference on January 6th, for example, the sweatshirts and the the things that various people said, but I don't think we know how yet to measure the effect of this education. The other thing is, you know, there is the human condition. We Roman Catholic Christians have talked about original sin when we try to explain what is it about human beings that kind of we're always fighting against doing the evil thing. I think we don't understand the human condition either. It's a mystery, you know, just as evil is a mystery as much as goodness is a mystery. And so I'll stop there. Perhaps, John, you might have
I would like to make an observation and then a comment. One of the things that was present in several of the presentations we heard is that Holocaust studies has a way of taking us somewhere else. You know, the multi-directional memory theme came up, that memory of the Holocaust leads us to deal with issues about memory and other atrocities, circumstances. You know, Debórah was saying that, you know, probably her interest in refugees and the Holocaust now kind of, you know, raises in her mind the importance of studying refugees writ large in some way. I found this in my own campus, that the center I helped to found that was really rooted in the Holocaust morphed into a human rights institution. And I'm fighting now to bring it back into contact with the Holocaust as a kind of anchoring reality. So I think this is one of the interesting things that's going on, and it raises the question of, if Holocaust studies takes us somewhere else, then what happens to Holocaust studies? James stressed the two-way street theme, which I like, but I think that's an avenue that has to be explored. What is the dialectical relationship there? Then the comment I want to make has to do with the theme that I use the word modesty to get at. I think it's true that Holocaust studies has been shouldered with trying to carry more weight than it can bear. That there were assumptions about Holocaust education, about creation of museums, about, you know, even the discipline, the academic field, that somehow if we did this right, we could reduce anti-Semitism, for example. We could maybe cut into the impact of racism and things of that kind. But as I said in my remarks, what I found in experience is that the more I did this work, the worse the world became. Not because of my work, as I said, but in spite of it. So there's that, and that leads me to modesty as something that I think Holocaust studies needs to embrace. It can't bear all the weight that has been put upon it. But there's a dialectical turn in this too, and that is we can become too immodest and just go on with writing more historical narratives and doing one thing and another. And if we get too modest, we forget what James said was important in the reflections that were going on about memorials in Germany at the time of the atrocities in Kosovo. And that the issue, as one person raised about the memorial, is what does it inspire us to do? And that becomes crucial for me because fundamentally, I think we study the Holocaust because we know that something terribly wrong happened during those years. And we can't be immodest about that. And that has to keep having a bearing on what we do and what we're inspired to do, while at the same time avoiding putting more weight on Holocaust studies and education than it can bear.
Raz and Lisa wanted to intervene.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of you. I have a, I have a comment, a question. I think one thing that I'd like to hear a bit, we're talking about the exceptional character of the Holocaust in the world, and there's different approaches, but I think that we can't ignore the way in which Holocaust studies in various ways, certainly today, in the last 30 years, is tied to state institutes and state power, right? And I think that needs to be part of the discussion when we think about what Holocaust study does, what it can do, and how modest or immodest, for example, we can be about it. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation, Holocaust studies and state power. Another thing related to that, of course, is that I think we need to keep in mind that when we think about the exceptional character of Holocaust studies, in the eyes of who? Because the exclusionary nature of Holocaust studies, if to rephrase a bit, maybe along your lines, Debórah, of what you said, is in the eyes of who? So some of you mentioned the Roma here in your responses. Roma are persecuted very significantly today throughout Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, by the way, right? In some cases in measures that amount to genocidal violence according to the UN definition even, right? Politicians, state leaders were also tied to the institutes of Holocaust memory then speak freely about quote unquote solving the Roma problem, right? So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well, right? State power and the voices of victims, right? If for me, the voices of victims are a crucial lesson from Holocaust studies and from studying the Holocaust as the historian of the Holocaust. We need to listen to them today, especially victims like Roma who continue to be victims of state violence and state power.
Maybe I'll jump in here. I'm listening to Debórah and John and Roz. These are, and this question, why expect Holocaust studies to change everything? Your comments are very thought-provoking, that there's a certain way. I go back to what Debórah said in her initial comments that, is this serving as a block? Is this getting in the way of understanding other forms of oppression? But I guess and I think all of those are such important thoughts. But if Holocaust studies doesn't take up this burden, then what is it? I'm reminded of one year in my Holocaust class at the end of the semester when I was trying to wrap up and have some brilliant conclusion. I said something like, we always say never again, but of course it goes on. There's still genocide, there's still horrible oppression and violence. And there was a student who just raised his hand and he said, well, Dr. Leff, there's nothing like the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened in Europe and it happened in a civilized place. And the other things that go on today, they're happening in totally uncivilized places. And I realized, you know, the horrible failing of the class to reach this student, my horrible failing, that if there's anything that I wanted students to get out of this is some understanding that it's what happened in Europe and what may be happening today somewhere else. It's not civilization versus uncivilization, right? There's a basic connection between these things. So, I mean, that's why, though all of your points, I take them to heart. I don't think we can give up on the desire to make Holocaust studies relevant for understanding other forms of oppression. We just can't, you know, why do we need it to change everything? Because otherwise, why do we study it?
May I just ask Debórah a question? In your essay in our book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, you talk about the Holocaust as your moral compass. And I mean, your comments about that are very moving. And so if it's your moral compass and it's not, it apparently is not a block for you, why this argument that the Holocaust is a block in terms of understanding or studying or giving attention to other instances of genocide or genocidal events? I don't get it.
Shall I respond, or James? Okay.
Why don't you respond to Debórah, and then we'll give James the right.
It is absolutely true. The Holocaust is my compass. It is my up, my down, my way of understanding the world and the way that I interpret the world. And John, when you said the Holocaust found you, you didn't find it. This is my fate. This is who I am. This is the way my world has been shaped. This is what gives shape to my research and to the way that I think. But over the years, I've come to realize that what is a strength, what is helpful, at the same time can also be a hindrance, as I say, and that using the Holocaust as I do, relying upon it, depending upon it, to help me chart my way forward, to help me understand what I wish my government were doing today and did yesterday and will do tomorrow, that might have been limiting my view. So, for example, I talked about environmental studies, and I do think that we're only beginning to feel the very first hints of how important that degradation and ruin and destruction is going to be on human beings around the globe. But I didn't think about it sooner, first of all, because I'm foolish, but second of all, because Holocaust studies did not include that, and I just didn't think about it. So it was thinking about what I don't think about that made me realize that while my compass is going to be my compass, it sometimes failed me in seeing a larger picture.
James.
Thank you for that, Debórah. So John and Carol asked us to write our Holocaust Studies origins stories for this volume, which gave us a chance to go back and figure out, well, what was it? You know, when did it find us, or when did we find it, and how did that evolve? And in my particular case, it was a matter of going to graduate school, either going to graduate school, which I didn't talk about in my reflection, or going to law school. And when I was going to law school, I came very close to going to Hastings Law School in San Francisco, University of California. and had even lined up an internship at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I was going to go into public advocacy of some sort. Instead, I went and did my dissertation on Holocaust literature and ended up spending 2 years in Israel writing it. And think of the end of my reflections were mostly about all the contemporary catastrophes, we're undergoing, and the ways that my attention now is mostly focused on, excuse me, trying to understand, for example, how the Lynching Memorial works, how the Lynching Memorial took its cue in many ways from the Denkmal in Germany, how Brian Stevenson has asked us this further question that didn't really arise in our Holocaust context. When does memory serve justice? How do we think about memory in the service of justice, and not memory that kind of culminates in itself? And I realized that that was one of the things that we thought we were trying to do in Holocaust studies. And this reminded me of this whole generation of young Germans who began to worry that all this preoccupation with Holocaust memorials in museums and all this work on Holocaust memorials might become a substitute for action. Instead of creating Holocaust memory as an inspiration for intervention in new persecutions, they worried that we were just kind of remembering the Holocaust in kind of this repetitive loop over and over again. And this is why Joschka Fischer's, reaching out, using the memory of the Holocaust to inspire Germany to intervene in an ongoing genocide was so important. That memory and study of the Holocaust should never become a substitute for action or intervention, but must always be the floor, of our action, the inspiration for our action, kind of the basis for it. I'd like to come back to kind of where we think this is going and look at the various names that we've now assigned of these institutes for the study of the Holocaust, genocide, memory studies. And even at UMass Amherst, when we were trying to figure out, what to call it, it was very clear to me in 2010, when we established the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, there would have to be all of these things. And in a way, I know that Alon has now added several more dimensions in his work to what goes on at the Institute. I mean, we could have Holocaust, Genocide, Memory, and 1948 studies, or Holocaust, Genocide, Memory, and critical race studies. I mean, we could continue adding these on, and just to make very clear that one need not take the place of all the others, but one necessarily needs to add to the others. It's kind of my notion of collected memory over collective memory, that we collect all these parts, and all of these parts actually have all kinds of connective tissue, which we need to acknowledge and look at that, again, that reciprocal exchange between Holocaust studies and memory studies and critical race studies, and allow all those things to exist simultaneously. So again, thank you.
Yes, Debórah.
Yeah, I would like to pick up that thread that you just laid down, James, about the names of institutions. Initially, the Strasser Center was the Center for Holocaust Studies because we did not have faculty on staff who dealt with other genocides. And the minute that we hired somebody who dealt with the Armenian genocide, the name changed to Holocaust and Genocide Studies. That initiated a whole debate. Should we call it Holocaust and Genocide, or should we call it just Genocide Studies, because the Holocaust was, of course, a genocide. And at that time, the decision was taken to keep Holocaust and add on genocide. Just in September 2020, when this new center that I direct at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, when we developed it, And that sparked a really lively debate. Once again, what should we call it? Should it be the Center for Holocaust Studies, Center for Genocide Studies? What about crimes against humanity? What about mass violence? And finally, we have this incredibly long and awkward name. And somebody just asked recently, well, might I give a course that actually doesn't deal with any one of those three things, but something related? Or does all of our teaching and all of our research have to refer back to one of the three buckets? So you can see that names, as we all know, words reflect concepts. And the trouble that we're having around these names is the trouble we're having around the concepts.
I'd like to give our audience the chance to ask questions. So I'm gonna present two questions to our panelists, and you can choose which one to answer, or both of them. Do the panelists see a difference between Holocaust studies and Holocaust pedagogy? And the second question is, in his Anatomy of Genocide, Omer Bartov shows that, at least based on his detailed study of perpetrators and collaborators, all the interviewees felt that they themselves were victims of the murdered Jews in this or that way. Would you agree that this is usually the case with all perpetrators and collaborators of genocide, that they feel victims themselves? And what are the implications of this claim to the future study of the Holocaust?
Well, the question about Holocaust studies and Holocaust pedagogy is much easier to answer. So let's go with that one, everyone.
Go for it.
I do think that there is a distinction with the difference. Holocaust studies, in my view, has to do with research and writing about the Holocaust. Holocaust pedagogy has to do with teaching the Holocaust. How do we teach it, and what are students learning? And I see Carol is nodding her head, so you're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, what I was going to say is Holocaust studies is the content, and Holocaust pedagogy is the delivery system, whether it's electronically, whether it's face-to-face lecturing, seminars, films. I mean, so I see a connection and absolutely a difference. So that would be my comments on that question. And I agree, the question about, the question isn't clear. The second question you asked, Alon, is not clear to me. I know that it's on the Q&A here, but it's still not, it's not clear to me.
So I may take a stab at it. The question is whether perpetrators feel victims. And I think the answer is yes. Perpetrators often feel victims. It doesn't mean that they are really victims, but they feel victims. One reason that they feel victims is, in order to kill other people, you need to have a very good story to go along with it. You need to explain yourself. Why do you do it? And one way to explain your own violence is by putting yourself in the position of the victim towards those that you victimize. In the case of the Jews, yeah, you can feel victims of the Jews as Bolsheviks, the Jews as controlling the world, the Jews as controlling the economy. So I think victimhood and violence go hand in hand. in mass violent events, not only in genocides, also in ethnic cleansing and other events. Not always, because I don't think historians would like to say always, but often. This would be my answer.
Can I jump in on that one too? I think that's, your answer, Alon, is really, yeah, I very much agree, remembering that the Germans marched into Poland to defend themselves against Polish aggression. There is something that seems to be a pattern there. When we talk about the remembering, and I think maybe part of the spirit of the question though was, then doesn't that create a problem that there are real victims and then there are people who feel themselves to be victims, and that could wind up being some sort of equivalency, and that's completely absurd. To me, I think one of the things that has potential about Holocaust studies, or maybe Holocaust pedagogy, is to try to get people to empathize with victims that are not their own projected selves, right? So Germans who after the war for many years remembered the German people as victims, that's really different than being able to remember Germans as victimizers. And that would be an aspiration of Holocaust studies, would be, could you ever empathetically put yourself in the position of an other, not just yourself as victim, but some other group?
Yes, John.
I want to go back to Debórah and Carol's comments about pedagogy, teaching on the one hand, and scholarship and Holocaust studies on the other. I think they make too simple a distinction. It seems to me these are two realities that are constantly engaging one another and interpenetrating one another. I guess I would imagine I'm not alone in having events that took place in my classroom, including comments and questions from students that changed my research, that led me to see things that I hadn't seen before, or made me think about questions that I hadn't considered in quite the same way previously, including, I would say, the way in which students were crucial in pushing some of us in Holocaust studies to explore other genocides. If you're teaching a course on the Holocaust in 1994, students were going to bring up Rwanda. And so I think that there's that dynamic that it is important to keep an eye on. And secondly, as Holocaust studies develops, as the scholarship develops, as the questions develop and change, then that feeds back into what the pedagogy is, and what the teaching is like. For example, probably if any of us are going into a classroom tomorrow or later in next week, after being in this discussion about what Holocaust studies is and what it can do and what it can't, it's likely that will affect what we teach or what we talk about or what we think about in the classroom. So I think the connection between the pedagogy and the content, the scholarship, is one of these places where it's a two-way street.
I would like to raise another question by one of our audience. To what extent might the centrality of the Holocaust in genocide research also be a reflection of the structural setup of global academia, Anglophone, Europeanist, in terms of history, literature, languages, graduate training, largely Euro-cultural-centric, Eurocentric, with an emphasis on the Second World War? I think it relates to some of the discussion that we said about exceptionalism. Exceptional to whom? And when we think about victims, maybe there are other victims. It's not an either or, this is clear, but the centrality of the Holocaust is also clear. So I think it's not enough to say, perhaps, that we want to bring everything together because the Holocaust still has a dominant position. So I'm just helping our question a little bit to be, to articulate it. Is this a subversive question? Uncomfortable.
So I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is probably yes. I think that global academies do tend to be a little bit Euro and Anglo and North American centric. We have a hugely industrialized academic press. We write about things and publish things. Our journals are, kind of the state of the art around the world. They fill the libraries around the world. So there is probably some hegemony going on, academic hegemony, no doubt. But again, if we can allow this to become a two-way street, kind of academic power, economic power, political power, industrial power are certainly all related. So how then can we be informed by the unempowered and the less highly even publicized disasters, mass murders, catastrophes? And I think of a talk I gave in India a couple of years ago, in which it was clearly the most interesting questions I had were from students and professors of what they call partition studies in India. Another part of what could be 1948 studies. And the partition between India and Pakistan is something they're still working on, and they came to listen to Holocaust-related talks on memory in order to figure out, well, is there something for us here? And actually, I took away that I think there might be something for Holocaust studies. The more we learn about the problems of partition in memory in India, between India and Pakistan. And there's even a partition museum up in the mountains where nobody ever goes because it's so hard to get to, where they're trying to find that common space to work through this question of whose story is going to dominate. The Pakistani version, the Indian version. Will it be, in the end, a colonial question and a decolonialization question? That too? Does that get subsumed into decolonialization studies? And so the question actually reflects, I think, a very particular and a persuasive reality that we actually have to struggle with and think hard about.
We have too many questions that we can answer, but I'd like to ask you some of them. What are the understudied topics in Holocaust studies these days, do you think? Where should we take Holocaust studies in terms of new historical research? Another question is perhaps one implication of these excellent and candid reflections is that whatever current relevance of Holocaust studies will emerge in active collaboration with people who bring other commitments, experiences, and expertise, not only field of studies, but for example, engaged activists, maybe organizers or lawyers. In that frame, no one needs to dilute the specificity of what they know, but what may matter is what emerges between these spaces. I think this is very much in line with what James tried to say. I think that inevitably means being political, which we will know will provoke, event other challenges. Any thoughts about these?
I would like to invite Lisa to address the kinds of, not the places where we should be going, but she and I work together with fellows at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. Lisa's the director of that center. She has her finger on the pulse of not where studies should be going, but where they are actually going. If you at least would like to share.
No, I was going to say, you know, one of the really interesting areas that we get so much growing interest is the intersection of Holocaust studies with areas of the world that one might have thought had nothing to do with the Holocaust. So the Holocaust in Asia, which includes stories about refugees before the war, during the war, after the war, being expelled again, you know, these stories about Shanghai, or Latin America, or Africa. And that these studies, you know, you meet some people working on them and you initially will think they're isolated, but in fact, this really seems to be a growing trend. So this kind of connective histories or multiple, was it Debórah who said refugee studies? A lot of it is that, but some of it is also the way these histories intersect with other histories of fascism or authoritarianism. And I think those are incredibly promising. And then the other area that I think is just connecting Holocaust studies to other histories of oppression where they're not directly intersecting. So you know, you guys know this book by James Whitman about Nazis' view of US law and adopting race law and thinking that American race law was too radical for them to adopt in its entirety. Studies like this, which are also connections, I think are getting more and more popular. And then the other thing I would say is the work on Ukraine being done by Ukrainians is another area of just great flowering right now. And not just Ukraine, but really all over Eastern Europe, huge explosion of work being done there on their own regions. James, do you want to add anything? Because you also work with us as an advisory capacity.
I just think you've introduced exactly where we are going, and we would not have prescribed it in any way. We wouldn't say this is where they should be going, but we realize that we can't think about this without looking at refugee studies right now, and how much refugee studies, again, teaches us about the Holocaust, but how much Holocaust-related refugee studies actually teaches us about all kinds of mass migrations right now. You know, Latin America and Southeast Asia. And we have to be open again to that reciprocal exchange, you know, between them and the museums more and more. I mean, we see what comes in and who's applying to come and why they feel like they need to do the work at the Holocaust Museum, which is so interesting. And sometimes we wonder, well, what is the connection? And then, of course, it's very easy once we've read the proposal to see what that connection is. They do need to do the work there. And just as I think the Holocaust historians, you know, need to be doing the work now more and more in South America and parts of Africa.
I agree. And, you know, sometimes I think when I think about the Holocaust as a research field, when I was a grad student or when I wrote my dissertation 30 years ago, and now how many new topics we have. and developed a subject that we didn't even think 30 years ago to think about the Holocaust within this framework. And I can give only one recent example, which I think is a very important example, is the book by Bashir and Amos Goldberg about the Holocaust and the Nakba, which does not compare them, but look at the memory and historical associations that linked them in the 40s. And this is a book that historians would not even thought of 20 or even 10 years ago. And now there is a very, very serious scholarship about it. Of course, there are people who disagree, there are people who think differently, but it is now on the table, and very serious scholars have done very serious work about the various links between them. So we don't know what the future of Holocaust studies will be, but it will surprise us. That's for sure. Raz, did you want to say something?
No, that was perfect. Maybe we leave
John,
1 or 2
would
minutes
like
for
to say
last
something.
comments.
Yeah, and maybe we'll give
I just want
the last word if you wish. Please, John.
I don't know if this is where Holocaust studies should go, or whether it just fits the pattern that James was mentioning, that the field has a life of its own and it goes where it goes. But Carol and I and some others are involved right now in an interesting project which has to do with what does it mean to be a Holocaust scholar in the midst of pandemic? How is that affecting our thinking about our research, our ability to even do the research, our ability to use the two-way street of thinking of Holocaust and pandemic in its multiple senses, and pandemic and Holocaust? I mean, it opens up a variety of interesting questions and issues. So stay tuned, because Carol and I are working on a sequel to Advancing Holocaust Studies.
Any last words from anyone?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's exactly 6 o'clock. There are many questions that we didn't answer, obviously. And I see this as an opportunity to have us all back here after a few months of reflection.
Maybe this time in person.
Oh, this will be wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye.